Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the final episode. Sona and I will be discussing the final episode of the Apple TV Plus mystery thriller, question mark, presumed innocent, the Jake Gyllenhaal starring adaptation. This week's episode is The Verdict. Sona, I will warn the listeners that I think I'm going to announce who the killer is pretty much early on in this discussion, because I had to think about that when I was rewatching or scrubbing through the episode just to take notes, because I think it matters. Some of the behaviors here, or I should question some of them. And I want to ask you some questions. So I'm going to put it out there pretty early on. But what I did want to preface this whole conversation with one minor caveat. I was planning originally, and maybe we will have a follow-up conversation where I talk about the ending of the novel and the original.
Yeah, I was wondering if we were going to discuss that.
And the reason I don't think I want to bring it up now, I do want to tease it out to the audience that if you haven't watched those, I'll just say that the ending is different. So you could probably watch those and enjoy them. I don't think we should spoil it, although maybe we could talk around it a little bit here without being explicit about it, because you know what? I don't want to spoil it for someone who hasn't seen it. And at first I thought, well, who cares? It's an old movie, whatever else. But if you've just watched this show, you can commit to a less than 2-hour movie to see the alternate version and actually a much more accurate version of the original novels. I do recommend the original Alan J. Pakula film. And maybe we will have a follow-up conversation. I don't know if there's a lot of shows we may want to discuss here until maybe middle of August. So maybe we could just rewatch the movie and then have a follow-up conversation and compare and contrast. But I do want to put it out there just for the fact that if you were curious, should I go and watch the movie? Am I going to get exactly the same thing? You are not. It's very different. And even the ending is different. So anyway, my minor caveat, go check it out. It's very stylish, very much of its time, these kind of adult thrillers. I do want to mention that there is, when you think about the Carolyn character there, who is slut shamed, and also when you think about how the story resolves, it did make me think about how much male panic is in all of those thrillers, by the way, from the 80s
of that time. Absolutely. Fatal Attraction being the epitome of it all.
And this one, of course, women potentially destroying this guy's life, even dead women potentially destroying this guy's life. And of course, Basic Instinct, disclosure, right? Towards the end of this cycle of thrillers. And speaking of Alan J. Pakula, I mentioned to you that a prototype for the erotic thriller 10 years before it became a real thing, like a cultural force, is the movie Clute that I had recommended, which was from 1972, like a full decade before this cycle of films. And as I mentioned, it's not really an erotic thriller, but it's almost the template for all the erotic thrillers that came later. And that same year, by the way, maybe the very first of these erotic thrillers, a prototype for Fatal Attraction, is a movie called Play Misty for Me, which is most famous for having the Roberta Flack song, The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face, which is also Clint Eastwood's first movie directing. And it is basically almost beat for beat the plot of Fatal Attraction, except he's a radio DJ and it's his fan who starts to stalk him. He becomes obsessed with him. But once again, men very afraid of sexually liberated women
cannot keep it in their pants, and as a result, it will end them.
It'll end them, right? Which is maybe a metaphor also, by the way, 70s through the mid 80s. Also the fear of venereal disease, right? So it's a kind of a metaphor for that as well. This is a very interesting topic to me, this moment of subverting this cultural tensions into this genre of movie. But maybe we will revisit some of these, because I know that you're also fascinated by these. And to the audience at large, if you are interested in this topic as well, check out You Must Remember This, the podcast. Karina Longworth's very popular podcast, way more popular than we are. But if you don't know about it, do check it out. This most recent season, both seasons, one was erotic 80s, the other one was erotic 90s, and it was about this cycle of films. Really incredible historical work she's done on that podcast. And also, if you do catch up on her podcast, go back and check out her season on Manson and Hollywood. It's an incredible series of one of the best seasons of a podcast I've ever heard. Okay, those are some podcast recommendations and other recommendations off the top. just as a caveat, I've digressed myself here, but just that we are going to spoil some of that here in this conversation. Okay, before we spoil anything at all, Sona, what'd you think of this episode?
I liked it. I think there are some logistical issues they left unaddressed that I wish they had tied up a little more neatly in a bow. But I do find it is a satisfying ending and an intriguing one.
Yes, I am intrigued by it. It made me ask a lot of questions. As I was taking notes, I started putting questions right into my notes because some of them are, like you mentioned, like, how did that happen? And some of them are like, oh, interesting. It's a mix of both things. I do want to point out here also, everybody who's curious about this, maybe I'll include it in the show notes. There was an article this week talking about how Apple TV Plus was just spending money like you would not believe. Some of these numbers are astronomical and really getting very little return for reward, and just showing how far ahead, based on the Nielsen numbers, that Netflix numbers are so far ahead of everybody else that some of these shows don't become hits until they rerun on Netflix. Netflix basically has become cable TV. It's so ubiquitous. And basically all these other services are just picking up the scraps. And Apple TV may be the worst of all. HBO, even Amazon Prime, like The Boys just wrapped up last week, still has these big signature shows. And Apple TV just has not figured that out. And I don't even want to digress the conversation again, but maybe I will have a segment on this as well. I just watched the pilot episode of Lady in the Lake, which was excruciating. I don't understand why you make a pilot episode like this, where you introduce 25 different characters all at once. You have to give me, this isn't a novel. It's a huge problem with Apple TV, I think. You can't adapt a novel. TV shows are different. You need to give me a hook. You need to give me a character. And then through that character, you start to reveal your world. You don't just throw 75 people at me and just assume that I am pot committed. At first, I have no idea what's going on in that pilot. I have no idea what I'm supposed to be paying attention to. I don't know what anyone's motivations are. You get introduced to a character, and 15 seconds later, they're having a flashback to some trauma from years before. I don't even know this person's name yet. Why make a pilot like this? This is a disaster. And the reason I mentioned that is Apple TV has, according to this article, their strategy was to oftentimes pick up these books that were bestsellers and then attach them to these big stars and pay them a fortune. And Sona, these numbers are astronomical. They were talking about the Masters of the Air, which cost $250 million for 9 or 10 episodes, which seems like a lot, but of course, lots of special effects recreating the war. But Sona, check this out. They announced that with all the production delays on Severance season 2, that show is going to cost $20 million per episode.
I saw a headline about that yesterday. Yeah.
It costs almost as much as Masters of the Air, and these people are in cubicles. Like, what is going on with the spending at this company? And of course, the reason they spent so much with the show that they were obviously having significant problems with was because they desperately need this one hit show, one of the few hits they have, to hit again. And they've already renewed it for season 3. And who knows if season 2 is even going to be successful. And it's already been off the air for almost 4 years. Does anyone remember anything that happened in the show anymore? It's pretty amazing, this whole article. And now I'm going to circle it back to where we're going here. Basically, what they're saying is they are not giving up on TV business, but what we're going to see a lot more of are series like Hijack and Presumed Innocent, which I find very funny. They have these very highfalutin Lady in the Lake prestige dramas that nobody is watching, and obviously was a bad strategy for them, but they've produced so many of them, they have to keep putting them on the air until their pipeline changes, obviously. And now they're starting to say, where do we get popular traction? Trashy Hijack, the thriller, trashy Ted Lasso, which did well. A one of one for them also, because they really haven't replicated that, although they'll probably have spin-offs, which is what always happens with these things. So Lasso has been a huge hit for them, no doubt about it. I think in 2023, Nielsen revealed that Ted Lasso, that season of Ted Lasso, was the most watched season of anything on TV. So that was a huge hit for them. And somehow they cannot port that over into their other shows. And they spend a lot on these shows, right? Like Silo, which is coming back for season 2, another sci-fi show, so many sci-fi shows, or Foundation, incredibly expensive shows that really very few people are watching. So it's crazy what they're spending. I guess they can afford to. They're multi-trillion-dollar companies. All that is to say that I think Apple TV's output is going to change significantly. And that's probably why they renewed Presumed Innocent for a second season.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so all that is to say that this particular show, they needed to succeed. It has done well. Very curious as to how they extend this franchise. Maybe we could talk about that at the end. But this show, I agree with you. I had my ups and downs with it. I love the beginning of it. It was not as good a show as it started itself off to be. I have a lot of criticisms of the way David Kelly writes his series, I think, and maybe I'll touch on some of those things here. But we discovered in the course of this episode that the killer is Jaden, his daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to say anything about that before we get into the breakdown?
This might not be what you're thinking, but our last discussion, I kept saying there's something up with these kids.
Yep.
They're acting so strangely. And what I didn't say is I was concerned that it was because they were just inexperienced compared to Jake Gyllenhaal and Ruth Negga. And so their acting was just paling in comparison, and they were coming off very strange. I'm happy that there is a reason that, that the daughter specifically seemed very off kilter to me. So at least I feel like that was leading to something and not just a weird discordant thing that was happening in the atmosphere for no reason.
Yeah, last night when I was watching this, I texted to you saying, we were right about everything, ... kind of. Because last week we were like saying, it had to be two people. They have to be in the same house. The kids are acting really weird. So mix it all together. We get the right answer. Okay, so we start things off, the fire poker. This is where I'm going to call out a kind of annoying thing that David E. Kelly does. This is why I kept calling everything last episode a red herring. Because it feels arbitrary to me. Even if it matters, it feels arbitrary. And this is a perfect example. They introduce this thing and then immediately they dispose of it. Tommy calls the cops. It doesn't become a moral dilemma for him. He just calls the cops in the cold open of the episode practically. They're there. And then we have all this talking about Tommy must have done it. Then why would he have called the cops about it now? The show is trying to explain why the fire poker's there. And none of the explanations that anyone comes up with really make any sense because really, once again, this is a pet peeve of mine with David Kelly shows. These hooks at the end of episodes or some of the plot twists are there for us as the audience. They don't make sense in the context of the show. They're for us to watch. I don't like that. That's what I consider soap opera type plotting. It's almost like winking at the camera. And I'm like, I don't necessarily like that, especially in a mystery. I want to be vested in what's happening. I think that for something like that to work, it has to matter in the story. Oh, now we go in a different direction with the investigation, which leads to, it has to do both things at the same time. It can't just be like, oh my God, they found a poker.
It's very dun, dun, dun. But as we discussed, why would this happen? What would someone's motive be for this happening? Which they did try and explain, but.
And only in the first scene. Once that first scene is over, the poker does not matter at all to anything else in the show. Other than the fact that we find out that someone obviously came back to deliver it, and that's the person we care about discovering at the end. But again, it's arbitrary. It could have been a rock that was placed there with a note on it. It doesn't matter. Yeah, so there's no DNA on this thing. There's no trace evidence. Once again, let's just make this thing not matter at all. There's not even like someone else's DNA that's unidentifiable. And what does that mean?
Told you it looked very clean.
It's very clean, yes. And then scrubbing through the episode. Specifically, I wanted to see Rusty talk to Barbara. This is why I wanted to lay out who the killer was, but wanted to have this part of the conversation with you. He reveals at the end of the episode that he covered up the murder to protect who he thought committed the crime, who in his mind, the only person that could have been was Barbara. And then he's having this conversation with Barbara about the fire poker and why would Tommy bring it in now? If you believe this woman was the person who put the fire poker there, this conversation doesn't make sense. If it was a very heightened conversation and he's looking at her intently, looking for a tell, but they're having a very casual conversation playing out these, and it just did not make sense to me. He can't at that moment actually believe she's the one who did this in the context of the show.
I think that's a great point. Something that I did happen to read online, although it doesn't negate your point whatsoever, is that the actors weren't told who did it until the last episode. I don't know if that's true or not. I think that's an interesting choice.
Right.
I think it deprives them of the chance to maybe make this even more satisfying than it was by saying, oh, I saw the way he looked at her, or whatever it may be.
Right.
So I'm not sure I agree with that choice if it is true. But regardless, at this point, they all know who did it. So it is very strange. It's not something I thought about when I watched it, but I think you're making a really good point.
Yeah, it's the thing that honestly bothers me the most in this whole entire episode for the reasons you just said. If they're shooting the final episode, I assume at this moment the cast knows. So this is discordant, to say the least. But more important than that is, I think in retrospect, some of the things we saw earlier now make sense, things that bothered me in the show. For example, some of the very strange reaction from the family, because right in episode 1, I'm like, someone in that house committed this crime, but they were all so shocked by the news that I'm like, can these people be this shocked if one of them has committed the crime? I thought of the son, for example, early on as well as a possible suspect. So we talked about it on the podcast, but that doesn't really make sense. If it's one of these people, they seem really good at acting, but that potential illogical loophole has been closed to some extent because, it's not that they didn't know, one of them didn't know that they committed the crime or suspect that they might have, because there's more psychology to that as well. But regardless, that they're like, I certainly didn't commit a sex act or any of these other things that I'm seeing here. So this is a shocking twist, right? And we could save it for there. But it does make sense that, let's say Barbara had done it, and then she sees that news, she'd be like, what? That's not at all what I remember happened last night.
Definitely didn't tie her up. Yeah. One of my takeaways here is that this whole family is kind of psychotic. So
yes. Oh, absolutely.
That kind of might explain it too, just general personality disorders.
And the other thing it kind of addresses here as well is sometimes I was really annoyed at Rusty for turning on his wife and being like, what are you doing to me? How could you do this to me? And really blaming her at points for what was happening. I'm like, wow, what a jerk that he is. And now I think the show has actually done a pretty good job of, if we believe that he believed that she was, that had killed this woman that he loved deeply to protect the sanctity of their family, right?
Yes.
Then he, of course, is really conflicted. He's trying to be a good husband while living with a murderer, right? Which, of course, he is.
The outrage over the kiss with the bartender was like a misplaced anger. I am turning everything upside down so that you don't take the fall for this. And here you are kissing somebody else.
Yeah, and he says it here that you were so casual and so cold about everything afterwards. Can you imagine that you have someone that you love dearly in your home who you find out is a murderer, and you are basically racking your brain trying to come up with a way to protect them? You have covered up the crime, which could very well blow back on you at any moment, and you will take the fall for this whole thing. And they're just like, going shopping, talk to you later. Like, why isn't this bothering you more?
Yes, and you're not going to come to court while I'm going to trial for the murder that you committed,
and I covered up. Oh, God. I do want to go back to the fire poker. One more point I forgot to mention before we move on is that I just don't understand the whole theory that he comes up with. This is all subterfuge, so maybe I should just ignore it. But I just found that whole conversation between Ray and Rusty so annoying, where they're saying, just even trying to sell this to the jury as like, aha, he had the fire poker in his house, so that gives me reasonable doubt. Why would Tommy, who's gotten away with potentially killing this person, put this note in his house and then write F you? What staging is this? How crazy would Tommy be? Like, oh my God, I've had this thing in my house. I'm the murderer. I'm really scared that someone's going to find this out at some point. Oh, someone planted it here. And then they wrote this note on top of it. Think about the crazy levels of thought that would be required for this person to have incriminated themselves this way. It's utterly bizarre. But hey, anything is reasonable doubt. I guess the jury wouldn't maybe not know all this context and then be like, you know what, that Tommy guy, I really don't like him. Oh, and now the fire poker's in your house. At a very surface level, I guess it could minimally make the jury dislike Tommy more, possibly. But as Ray mentions, it could also make them think that, oh, you must have planted it there.
Yeah.
To incriminate first place.
There's a conversation between Rusty and his wife at the end of the episode. This is part of the reason that I thought this whole family is just insane. They're talking about the fire poker, he and his wife, and he says, I know it was the murder weapon. And she says, how do you know? Because it has a chip in it. I've used that poker to make a fire. He's casually discussing this date that he had with another woman with his wife. And I just thought, gosh, the ship has really sailed. I'm feeling bad about this. Just saying, oh, and yeah, we ordered in Chinese food and we had a cozy night by the fire. We watched a movie. I thought,
exactly.
He
says, good thing my fingerprints weren't on there. And she has this uncomfortable look. This is Barbara.
Yeah,
right?
he's just discussing it. There's no point in acting like I'm embarrassed about the fact that we would build fires and have a nice night in together. I don't know. Because God help my husband if he ever decided to discuss going on a date with another woman like that in front of me. Never mind all of these other circumstances that are going on around this.
Well, let's stop at this Thai place over here. And you're like, oh, I've never been here before. It's like, oh, it's really good. How do you know that? This is where I used to go all the time with that woman who ended up dead that I dated for while I was married to you.
Remember the one I got pregnant, remember?
Remember the one I got pregnant a few years back? I went to court and I almost went to jail. And our daughter was murderer. Oh, yeah, that thing.
Anyway, the pad thai here is so good.
But the noodles, so good. Okay, speaking of noodles, the next topic I have is the food, right? So now they bring in this medical examiner. Yes. Obviously, this is a TV show, so even if this was real, we haven't seen everything. But this is a pretty big hole in the logic of the defense, right? They basically have her go up there and say the food arrives around 10, that if it's fully digested, I don't know how she gets to 3 o'clock in the morning, to be honest with you. But regardless, it had to be later than, what did they say, 11 was supposedly when she was murdered. So that obviously...
She needed 4 hours for it to get out of the stomach.
Right.
So I guess she was rounding. Yeah.
Between 1 and 3, yeah. So I guess it's like an interval there. As a jury member, I would think this is a pretty compelling piece of evidence because the food was eaten, right? The containers are there. What is the prosecutor's case? That she didn't eat you can't prove that she ate that food. Okay, she didn't eat the food. She was murdered at 11, about an hour after the food arrived. And then the killer sat there and ate the food.
Ate some dumplings. Yes. And
then put the food containers into the garbage can.
Yeah. This is one of the logistical things that I wanted a tighter answer to, as to what the exact timeline was of the multiple people's visits to her house throughout the night.
It's a Grand Central Station over there.
I would have liked to have actually seen a visual timeline somehow of the times that everybody came and went from this house and where the Chinese food fell into this, because was the expert correct about this timeline and the ME or whoever decided the time of death was wrong, or vice versa? I'm just curious.
This is another thing that's very confusing to me. So Rusty leaves around 10 o'clock. That's the photo, the video we see of him leaving her apartment that her son had recorded. So it's 10 whatever. This is when the food arrives, around the time the food arrives, before or after, I forget exactly the timestamp on the receipt. So she has ordered food because she's hungry after he leaves. And then the son conveniently does not record the next part. And then we would assume that Jaden shows up shortly thereafter, around midnight. And two things here. One, he thinks that Barbara committed the crime, but theoretically, wouldn't he be sleeping next to Barbara at this moment when she supposedly is murdering his girlfriend? Like, what do they do? Are they just out alone until 1 o'clock in the morning? Maybe, but that's a strange marriage to have. Or maybe he had to go back to the office to work for a while. I don't know. But it doesn't seem to make sense that if he believes Barbara did this, wasn't he home with her at the time, theoretically, or within minutes of when he expected her to have murdered her, which seems odd. And then also Jaden is out and about at midnight or whatever. So,
and that's what I questioned, because for some reason I thought this was a school night. I don't know why I thought that, though. And again, New York City living, we're in very close quarters here. So maybe I don't understand the whole suburban thing. but it feels to me like you would know that someone left your house and started the car and pulled out of the driveway, but maybe not.
And it's possible that she's an older teen, so it could have been a weekend. She might normally hang out with her friends and be out until later. So she rolls in at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. It's not surprising. That's a possibility.
Would have been nice to have a scene early on where they say something like, hey, I didn't hear you come in last night. What time did you get home? Or something establishing that she was out late that night. Maybe there was, and I just don't remember. I don't know.
Maybe. I don't remember in great detail everything we see in that first episode, but we definitely see the family in the house at some point. Basically, it's the calm before the storm, right? It is immediately before the events of the night, because the next morning, obviously, everything goes wrong when they find the body, yada, yada, yada. So maybe I should rewatch that first episode to see if maybe they do say, where's Jaden? Why is she home? She shouldn't be home by now? Like something like that. Maybe it's possible that it's there and we didn't notice. Obviously, we weren't looking for it at the time, but it does seem a little odd that he would suspect Barbara when I'm pretty sure he's with her in that first scene of the show. And that is basically the night before. I'd have to rewatch that whole thing because it's very questionable what's happening. He decides to defend him or to do the closing statement himself. Ray and his wife, Ray saying, oh, I don't agree with this, but I can't really step down at this time. He says that he's going to just garden afterwards and give his heart a rest, but he's going to stick it out for the rest of the case, which is what, like a day left now? At this point, little late to quit the case. He's practicing Rusty, that is practicing his closing statement. His daughter comes in. He says, "Et-tu, daughter," because he questions how realistic his final statement is going to be, which once again, I did want to just call that out because obviously she knows that he's now lying for her. And by the way, there are multiple times in this episode and in recent episodes where she gives him this big hug. And once again, I think this show does a good job in this episode of conveying that part of it is she knows that he is now potentially taking the blame for her if he's found guilty and trying to protect her. So I do think that those kind of tender moments between them have a little more resonance now.
Yes, and I like this whole dynamic of he thinks he's taking the fall for his wife. The daughter knows he's actually taking the fall for her. I think that's really interesting. And I would be possibly more interested in a rewatch of the entire series if the actors knew that the entire time.
I agree. I would recommend, I think that there are a lot of the things that I think have been resolved here are right in episode 1. So I might rewatch episode 1, which was good anyway. So I might rewatch it to see if it works, if it's pretty tight in that way, or at least as I think it is in my own mind. Okay, then we get the closing statements. I mentioned this to you in a text. I thought that his closing statements are really strong.
Agree.
I think that it's really emotional. And I think that Rusty was correct because when he's going up there, and it's not Ray saying, this guy might have done this. He's saying, look, I'm telling you right now, I didn't do this. He's convincing. If someone who's accused of murder looks you dead in the eyes and says, I didn't do this, that's really powerful. And even more so when he's saying, I'm a terrible person. I'm a terrible dad. I made terrible decisions, but that doesn't make me a murderer. And there's no evidence that I did do this. And that's why there is no evidence. And then I texted you and said, man, these prosecutors, at least, I don't know if this is always the case in Chicago or if they flip a coin like on a football game, but having the last say, especially because in the same way that a lot of what Rusty is saying is working on the jury emotionally, having the last say when it's mostly an emotional argument is really damning. And Tommy goes up there and also does a great job with a circumstantial case saying this guy's violent. Everything he just said to you, once again, you can only say this when you go last. Everything he just said to you, I can contradict with evidence that we've seen right here. He is desperate to catch the killer and yet is obfuscating evidence when he has the opportunity to do so. And he says he's not violent. And then we have multiple instances when he is violent, when he does snap, and he doesn't have to be a sociopath all the time. But if he snaps and gets violent, what happens when he snaps and gets violent in a room alone with Carolyn? Does something go too far? So it's a really damning case. But once again, purely circumstantial. There is no evidence of him being culpable for this crime.
Right.
If you were in the jury at this point, which way are you deciding?
I know it's possible to convict based on circumstantial evidence, but I think that evidence has to be super, super strong when you don't have anything direct. This is something that is so serious, and to wrongfully convict somebody and impose those consequences, in my mind, would be such a tragedy that I personally would be very unlikely to convict someone based entirely on circumstantial evidence.
I feel the same way. On an emotional level, I feel like it's arbitrary because they both play really strong emotionally. And if I had to make an emotional decision, it really is who made the last case. I think if you reverse these scenes, I might lean one way versus the other. But yeah, I think in a jury room, if someone sits down, okay, show me one piece of evidence, one piece of actual evidence. And I'm like, I don't have any evidence, none. And not only do I have no evidence, but then everybody has to be lying about where he was that night. He wasn't home. Everybody has to be lying if this is the case, right? By the way, maybe they are all lying, but jury can't say, if I just pretend everyone's lying, then the case doesn't hold up. But there's no case. So what are you basing it on? And given that fact that there is literally nothing other than hearsay and rumors and interpersonal office dynamics as a case here, he makes a really compelling case. I think I'm about to answer my own question. I was going to say, why would they even go forward with this case? But he says it, right? He says, this is a political case. The only reason this has even come to court is because there's a public outcry about it, and they're doing this to score political points, and they are politicians. I thought that was really compelling. I think that happens a lot of times where something goes to court because the people are saying, why hasn't this case gone forward? And there is no evidence, right? It's just purely to calm everybody down or to score some kind of political points.
Yep.
And then, of course, we find out that the verdict is not guilty. And then we see the fallout of that, right? We see everybody's reaction to it. We see the son's reaction to it, Carolyn's son and her ex-husband. We see Rusty giving an interview where he says, I'm dedicated to finding the real killer. Or is he? We see De La Guardia telling Tommy he needs to let it go. There still seems to be a lot of fixation on De La Guardia protecting Tommy to some extent and encouraging him to get over this fixation, which Tommy still apparently has not gotten over.
I thought it was a good way to have some closure on everything that had happened. But to be honest, knowing the ending of the book after the verdict and seeing that the verdict was not guilty, all I could think about was what was going to come next.
Right, of course.
So I really wasn't even paying that close attention because I could see how much time was left in the episode.
Yeah, especially because there's 15 minutes left.
Yeah,
exactly.
I honestly, I was not that interested. I just wanted to get through it. I think it was well done, though, and see what would come next.
I actually liked it, even though I obviously knew there was another shoe to drop. And I think everybody would. Right? I think people want to know who did do it. Right? That's why you watch these shows in the first place. And it wasn't just the amount of time that was left. It is almost like we're cleaning the table. And now here comes the real resolution. Right? So then we get to the big final reveal, of course. These people love doing cardio. So, of course, Barbara's doing cardio. And Rusty goes and checks in on her and says, I can't believe you're so cold-blooded. I knew it was you the whole time, and I covered up for you.
Wait, let me just go back for a second to something that I found a little bit comedic, whether purposeful or not. He's discovered she has this packed bag.
Oh, yes, of course, yes.
In the bedroom. And so he comes down all accusatory. We might as well go on a vacation since you've already packed your bags. And she says, the therapist told me to do that in case this ever happens again. And he has this incredulous look on his face. In case this ever happens again. In case you ever murder my mistress again.
Right.
So I just thought that it was really funny in retrospect, given the conversation they have after.
Yeah, I think that is what triggers his reaction. It's very funny that he reads it as, you mean in case someone else turns up dead that I'm sleeping with? And she's like, we don't have to get to the dead part, just the sleeping with her. That's the bad enough part, okay? You don't have to take everything so literally. So this triggers his whole, I can't believe you did this. You were so cold-blooded. He still doesn't explain his rationale as to, once again, to your point, that there should have been something suspicious, something with her car. She was angry at him that night and drove off, something that made him think, oh my God, it was her. It's just a regular family dynamic. Next morning, someone's dead, right? From his office and all the fallout from all of that, which all of that doesn't make sense. If he's covered up this murder, then he is playing it off really cool in that first episode when he goes and sees the body. Anyway, I think I have to rewatch because a lot of these things don't quite add up. But of course, it turns out it's not her, and that's why she's so shocked by this accusation.
To her credit, as an actress, I think there are a few minutes here, a few seconds where you don't know how to read her reaction, whether she's so outraged that he's thought this all along, or she's so devastated that he has discovered what really happened.
Right.
And so you're going along on this ride of which will it be, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, I found it really interesting, too, because the way I read her the whole time was not that she was guilty at all, but that as if she was not playing her hand too much, because we've probably been in that circumstance before where you're like, I'm not going to say anything. I want to hear what they're going to say.
Yes.
Okay. What's he going to say next?
Although, if it were me, I don't know if I would be able to restrain myself from saying, do you think I effing killed your mistress?
She's been through a lot, by the way.
What has been going on this whole time?
She's had to go through a lot right now. So I think maybe she's a little more flappable or unflappable. And then in the midst of this accusation, Jaden walks in and nope, it was me. And then we have a flashback to the night of, and Carolyn talks way too much here. By the way, let me just tell you something else. It's your dad's fault. It's not my fault, which is probably true. But you just got to have to deal with me because, have a baby on the way. He dumps. Which she seems to be a little wary of having this girl in her house. And then she comes forward with that. I don't understand.
Bad judgment.
Yes.
Theoretically, this is the thing that made Jaden snap, right? She could have just gotten this girl out of her house, but no. She had to tell her before she even told the father of the baby.
Yes. Yeah.
This doesn't quite add up for me as something that a person would do.
Right.
I think it's very interesting, and I need to think more about how they have portrayed Carolyn here. Because she seems to be one of those women that every man falls in love with, right? Because they even De La Guarda, I can never get his name right, but he even asked Tommy at one point, so how long were you in love with her? So one of these women that is just irresistible. Everywhere she goes, everyone is falling in love with her. But we also see that it's not because she's some manic pixie dream girl or just so amazing. She is covering up the DNA on the suspect to get the conviction. She is making catty remarks during this affair. Does Barbara do this for you? That last night that Jake Gyllenhaal, that Rusty goes and sees her, he says something about how she kissed him knowing it would keep him hooked, even though she was telling him that nothing could go any further, right? And that was part of what was driving him crazy. I'm not sure all of this adds up for me as to if she has these negative qualities, why is she so irresistible?
Right.
Certainly, we've all fallen for people who are not perfect people, but to the point of murder? I guess he didn't murder her, but you know what I'm saying. So,
but he would have if he could have. Just kidding.
I'm not sure I understand what they were trying to accomplish with this character because some of it seems conflicting to me.
Yeah, this is another, maybe the biggest problem I have with this entire show. I wrote down in my notes, she's an enigma and not in a good way.
And let me add, also, she wants no relationship with the kid she has. So what is going on here?
Yep, that's where I was going with my commentary. Exactly that. So going back to the original text, I don't remember her having a son. I'm pretty sure she does not have any child.
I don't remember it either.
She's not pregnant in that for sure. That's not part of it. I won't spoil too much, but she's basically a conniving, ladder climbing, and she's completely unapologetic about being that way. We find out multiple people in the office have slept with her. Maybe they're the suspects. There's a lot of red herrings in the book as well, just like there are in the show. Different ones, but very much similar in that way. And she is just this cipher of a very ambitious woman in the office that could destroy the men around her, right? Like we've seen a lot of these kind of erotic thrillers. And she's not a well-defined character. But here's an opportunity now, right, with this revisionist world we live in now, to have an episode where we see a flashback, where we interview someone who was a close friend of hers and gives us some insight into her. Because like you mentioned, we don't need her to have a teenage son. She could be a woman who doesn't have any children, who is having a child now with Jake Gyllenhaal.
Sure.
That is going badly, but she still wants the child, and maybe this is her last chance. That's a psychology I can understand. But she, like you mentioned, she has a son, has rejected him, has no relationship with him for many years, and now wants to desperately have this child. What is her motivation for any of this? Even if there was some flashback episode where someone says, she messed it up so bad with him, he hates her so much, she thinks it's better for him to not have that relationship, and she wants a second chance. Something. We know nothing about this woman. She makes arbitrary decisions, and everyone falls in love with her. For what reasons? We don't know, because she's just, in the flashbacks, we see her having a collegial relationship with Jake Gyllenhaal, which appears to have just evolved into something else. But all these other really negative traits in her, we have no explanation for them. I don't understand it. I think she's so badly defined here.
Yeah. And the idea of telling your affair partner's daughter that you're pregnant before you tell the affair partner also gives the idea that there's something a little cruel about her, right? That she's
that she
trying
did it
to
on
twist
purpose.
the knife.
I agree.
A little bit. I think they either had to make her, as you're saying, a conniving person who just wants to get ahead and will use any means to do so, or an enigma in a good way, manic pixie dream girl, or just so beautiful or so charismatic or whatever it may be, that everyone is just drawn to her like a moth to a flame, against their better judgment. But trying to have it both ways, that can't exist in one person, but I don't think it's something you see often.
We still need to understand that too. If she has something in her that is self-destructive, that's very possible, right? That at that moment when she is egging on the daughter, that maybe once again, if we had some kind of understanding that she does not have the atomic family, she hates the fact that at some level that this man has all those things that she cannot have, and this affair is in some way is transgressive, right? Because of that. That would make sense. But we need to see that in her somewhere. Right?
If we had seen some conversations between her and Rusty, to understand more about what the relationship was, because what we saw was mostly sex.
Yes.
Which is fine as far as affairs go.
Yeah.
But he keeps saying he had this obsessive love for her. Yeah. He was in love with her. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. I understand there is an infatuation lust period where maybe you feel that way, even though it's just sex.
Right.
But I feel like they let
that goes away at some point.
I feel like they let us to believe there's more here. But we never got to see why there's more or how there's more.
And you make an excellent point. There are two flashbacks, one before that Rusty has. One is before he gives his closing statement, and one is at the end, towards the end. And in both cases, as you mentioned, we do not have him and her having a heart-to-heart where she says, I screwed up my life so badly. I want to start over with somebody else. I want something else. Or says, I don't know what I want. Sometimes I want this. Sometimes I want that. And that ambiguity is what attracts him to her, or some memory of what he was when he was younger, when he was her age, etc. We don't see that. In both flashbacks, we see them having sex with each other. That's the only thing we ever see. Right. The fact that he can't see her as anything else is a negative connotation upon him, but it still doesn't explain any of her interactions. I know nothing about her, basically, is what it comes down to. And for a series that is supposed to make us believe that multiple people are so fixated on her that they could potentially murder her, for us to know nothing about her is a big problem.
Yes, I agree.
And then we end the series on a happy montage. Ray is tending the garden with his wife. At least they have a successful marriage. Jay is with nature, laying on a blanket, of course, alleviated of all her transgressions. Tommy's at home, being a cat daddy and watching football. This is actually sad. This is Thanksgiving, but he's all by himself. Yeah. He has no family, nobody.
He seemed happy, though.
He does seem happy. It's true. But has he alienated? Even his close family members will not have him over for Thanksgiving. And of course, we see the whole Savage family happily together for Thanksgiving. And at one point, at this moment, when I'm watching this, I'm like, is this saying that the suburban upper middle class family is just a bunch of sociopaths or just concerned with their own well-being? Perhaps that's what the show is saying, but it is undercut a little bit by that last look, face acting between Barbara and Jake, because under the surface of this happy-go-lucky, this reminds me of the ending of Hitman, by the way, under the surface is a murderous rage that can unleash itself at any moment.
Go back a little bit to when Jaden enters the garage and confesses. That reminded me of, did you watch Mad Men?
Yes.
I know this is nowhere like the same thing, but it reminded me of when Dawn is talking to Peggy about her pregnancy and says, this never happened. You'll be shocked how much this never happened.
Right.
It reminded me of that type of conversation. We've talked about this once. We will never talk about this again. And that is it. Regardless of whatever trauma you may be dealing with that would necessarily follow this sequence of events, we will never address it again. And then at the end, it did remind me of Hitman. And it also reminded me of, and I know you didn't watch this one all the way through, but You has... a season where the main character thinks he's looking for this typical happy suburban life at one point with this woman. And it reminded me of that, this on the surface suburban bliss. And then that kind of look that makes you realize these people are miserable. The face acting at the end gave me that same sense of they're stuck here, they're miserable, and they're all psychopaths.
And they have to act like everything's great.
For the rest of their lives.
Which does have some resonance there with the finale of the original movie in a very different way. So just leaving it out there like that. Yeah, I did like some of the notes that hit here at the end, although maybe... as I'm watching it, I was thinking in my head, everybody's happy now until that final shot, that lingering shot, which I think does undercut a lot of this. But there is this blissful, sun-drenched, beautiful, now the world is right again. All we had to do was murder that Carolyn. Oh, she was getting in the way. Yeah. Now everybody's happy again. Tommy can be home with his cat and not have to worry about Carolyn.
Gone Girl feeling too. Of the ending of that, where she's pregnant and they're the happy couple again. Oh God, what a great ending that movie has. It's such an incredible ending. Yeah, sorry if I spoiled that for anyone. Maybe it's very old though. It's only 10 years old now, believe it or not. Although 10 years is still a pretty long time. But I think, maybe we do a revisit on that one. But I think a spoiler is fair after 10 years. I didn't want to spoil Silence of the Lambs when I talked about that one. That's 35 years old. So I don't know. I'm not sure what the moratorium is on spoilers at this point. If we could just go back to one other logistical thing that's bothering me. Sure, please do. Because I specifically made the point that I thought previously that Rusty was not involved, because surely he would have blood all over him. Oh my God, good point. Good point. Okay, now I do understand Jaden with the fire poker, maybe the blood splatter works in your favor and it doesn't get on you. Although she did specifically say she disposed of clothing, I think, or disposed of some sort of evidence.
Right.
But Rusty, as the person covering this grim murder up, how did he not come home covered in blood? Or if he did, what happened to those clothes?
Right. Exactly. And there's all of that stuff. Once again, going back to maybe revisiting episode 1, there are these carpet fibers that were found under the body. And they said maybe even possible that the body had been transported there from somewhere else because there was a lack of blood evidence. All of that is gone now. And yeah, like you mentioned, the cleanup must have required some amount of effort and time. If there is no blood spatter, like even on the walls, even on the ceiling, nothing, then this must have been an incredibly detailed cleanup job. And again, how did no one notice this guy gone for many hours or see him go in or out of the building or whatever? It just logistically doesn't make any sense. Unfortunately, it does not. But I think we just have to take all of that with a grain of salt, that her building, she's a lawyer. She probably doesn't live in some rundown squat somewhere, but apparently she doesn't have a doorman. She doesn't have neighbors that care that people are going in there making noise at 1 o'clock in the morning, like loud thuds from the floor above. No questions about this. Maybe raised voices and then a clang and then the body collapsing to the floor. And then someone showing up and walking around, cleaning the entire place spick and span, like treading back and forth for hours at a time, cleaning every corner of the room. Nobody noticed any of this at 2 o'clock in the morning. Nobody. All right, or whatever. Maybe the building is so well built that even the floors don't creak. I don't know. None of that makes any sense to me. What are you going to do? And by the way, also the theory initially, maybe the body was brought here from somewhere else. Once again, nobody, like imagine that. If that is your theory, the prosecutors think potentially because the place is so clean, didn't someone see like a rolled up carpet someone carrying this human-sized bag up the stairs, or what is going on? This investigation was not very well done. I got to say, many questions that need to be asked here. But apparently, if they did ask people, they all said, I didn't hear nothing. Or at least that's the only logical conclusion.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that are left unresolved that we only know to ask about once this reveal is made in the last 15 minutes. So
Exactly.
I guess in a way I understand, but also just a few asides in the conversation, a few one-off comments would have at least answered some of those questions, I think.
Yeah. And they could have scripted it better, right? She could have had to stay in a hotel temporarily while they were doing construction.
Just maybe previously, as the series was going on, maybe I'm really throwing stuff against the wall here. Maybe there could have been a blackout. So nobody is using their Ring cameras or the street lights.
You wouldn't even need, I was just going to say, you wouldn't have even needed that to introduce the teenage son doing surveillance as that plot point. Imagine, didn't you hear any noise? Yeah, but people would go in and out of her apartment in the middle of the night all the time. Did you see anyone go in and out of her apartment? Yeah, I saw her boyfriend go in and out. He's in there all the time. And they're like, even at 2 o'clock in the morning, no, not at 2 o'clock in the morning. I didn't look. I was in bed, but I assumed it was him because he's in there all the time, right? And even that would be like, okay, it was him. That's enough evidence. Once again, that's the idea that this was all done in an apartment in Chicago and nobody heard, presumably an old apartment in Chicago from the look of it. And those things creak a lot. I'm telling you, I used to live in like a World War II walk up and those were creaking floors. So I don't know where she lives, but anyway, lots of questions on the logistics of the night of, but the night of, go watch that. But Oh, and of course, one more thing I want to mention to everybody is if you are curious about a fraught marriage and I think a much more interesting exploration of some of the topics here that this show does, listen to our conversation. Watch, of course, first Anatomy of a Fall, and then listen to our conversation about it, which is in our backlog. All right, so I don't know what we'll be talking about next. Maybe we will rewatch Gone Girl. I would love to. I just did Silence of the Lambs, so maybe let's go watch some of those classic thrillers and have a conversation about those. So maybe that Gone Girl could be the first.
Sure.
All right, cool. Let's try to do that for like next week.
Okay.
Or whenever you get around to it, but let's target next week. End of next week. All right. I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you later.